Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pamela, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Academy, Gary, fellow fellows, for making this a truly wonderful time. That introduction was exemplary, and I'm very grateful. It reminds me of when I started in academia. I was still a graduate student, and I was invited in Philadelphia to come and give a lecture about Soviet Armenia. There was a Soviet Armenia then. And the dragoons, a local intellectual, Armenian intellectual, a dentist, to give the introduction, and it went something like this. This young man is going to talk to us tonight about something. I hope he don't talk too long. So, I hope I won't talk too long for you. First, what happened? In late February, early March 1915, the Young Turk government of the Ottoman Empire ordered the disarming, deportation, and eventually the massacre of hundreds of thousands of its Armenian subjects. The first victims were soldiers who were demobilized from the Armenian army, made to serve in labor battalions, eventually forced to dig their own graves, and then killed. When some Armenians resisted the encroaching massacres in the city of Van in eastern Anatolia near the Persian border, the Committee of Union and Progress, which was running the country, the Young Turks, had the leading intellectuals and politicians in the city of Istanbul, several of them deputies to the Ottoman parliament, arrested and sent from the city. Most of them perished in the next few months. Women, children, and old men were systematically forced to leave their homes at short notice, gather what they could carry or transport, and to march through the valleys and the mountains of eastern Anatolia. The survivors reached the deserts of Syria, where new massacres occurred. By 1922, 90% of the Armenians of Anatolia and even a higher percent of Assyrians, a related population, were gone. It's estimated conservatively that between 600,000 and 1 million were slaughtered or died on the marches. Other tens of thousands fled to the north, to the relative safety of the South Caucasus, of Russia. Hundreds of thousands of women and children, we now know, were forced to convert to Islam and survived in the families of Kurds, Turks, and Arabs. My own great-grandparents were among the victims slaughtered in what at the time was called the Armenian Holocaust. Now, I can tell you that I have never been that interested in discussing whether or not there was a genocide. I think that anyone who looks seriously at the mountains of evidence, including the recently published German documents from the archives here, would have to conclude that these terrible events in which a specific ethno-religious population was singled out by a state and then deported and massacred, all of that carried out by the Young Turks, you would have to conclude that this would, under any conventional definition, be considered genocide. So I'm not so interested in that question, a question that has bothered and troubled Armenian scholars and others for a long time, because it seems to me that's not the important question, what you actually call the event. Rather, I'm interested in why it happened. Why did a government decide to eliminate a whole population of one ethno-religious group? Now, it's a little dangerous to try to do this kind of explaining. In fact, one prominent scholar told me that if you try to explain the Armenian genocide, you will end up rationalizing it and even eventually justifying it, as if explanation in itself would constitute justification. But I'm going to try that anyway. I'm going to talk first about those who say there was no genocide. This might be called the denialist position. Indeed, much of the existing literature, even by people who don't specifically deny that it occurred, still don't try to explain it. Now, for people who deny it, there's no need to explain. That is, they make an argument something like this, that raison d'etat, interests of state, justified the suppression of a rebellion, and mass killing is explained by the unfortunate residue, in the now fashionable language, collateral damage, of legitimate efforts of establishing order behind the lines. The denialist viewpoint might be summarized as there was no genocide and the Armenians are to blame for it. They were rebellious, seditious subjects who presented a real danger to the empire, and they got what they deserved. State security justified what was done to this rebellious, disloyal people. But the denialists also argue that there was no intention or no effort by the Young Turk regime to eliminate the Armenians as a people. Therefore, this could not be a genocide. I can tell you from the research I've done and from the great majority of scholars who have worked on this topic, Turkish, Kurdish, German, American, French, Italian, whatever, that this denialist account fails both empirically and morally. Its outrageous claims, however, have helped to shape the debate and have kept us from looking at explanation. So let me look at this denialist argument just for a moment. It goes something like this. Armenians and Ottoman Muslims lived in relative harmony for many centuries, and that peaceful coexistence was undermined by noxious outside influences. American missionaries, Russian diplomats, Armenian revolutionaries from the Caucasus, who worked to undermine the territorial integrity and the political system of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, the response of the government of the Ottoman Empire to the Armenian rebellion was actually measured and justified. And thirdly, basically it was the Armenians who brought on their own destruction, launching a civil war against the government. If you look at the evidence, I wish I had time to go through the mountains of documents, you'd find that, first of all, there was no harmony in the Ottoman Empire, but systematic discrimination. So the first criticism to be made is that you didn't need outside agitators to disrupt a relatively peaceful relationship that had existed between Armenians who, up to about 1878, the Russo-Turkish War, were known in Turkish as the Millet-i Sadika, or the loyal millet. That is, Armenians were treasured by the Ottoman government, unlike those rebellious Greeks and Bulgarians and Serbs and so forth, who had rebelled and formed their own states. But what was the situation between Armenians and Ottomans in the empire? First of all, I said that word, empire. The Ottoman Empire was not a nation state. It was a particular kind of political arrangement, an imperial one. An empire is best defined as a political system in which there are two important characteristics. One is inequality between those who rule and those who are ruled. And secondly, clear and institutionalized legal distinction between those who rule and those who are ruled. Indeed, it is precisely the difference between the superior and the inferior that gives the superior the right to rule. The British in India, they were going to bring civilization, the white man's burden to Africa or whatever. And the Ottomans were a special group of people, the Osmanlı, who in fact conquered, were Muslims, and had therefore the right, divinely endowed, to rule over other peoples of the book, Jews, Christians, and even other inferior Muslims. So that's what an empire was about. So yes, Armenians did well. Some of them, middle class, bourgeois Armenians, succeeded. The head of the mint in the Ottoman Empire was an Armenian. The emperor, the sultan's architect was an Armenian. Those things are true, but always as inferiors, always as people clearly marked as different and below the ruling Muslim elite. Most Armenians tried to improve their situation in the Ottoman Empire. Here you have a picture of a wedding and a middle-class family. What's most interesting and what was striking to me as I was doing my research is the way in which Ottoman Armenians tried to live within this Ottoman Empire, accepting the burdens of discrimination and inferiority. That is, they wanted to be good Muslims, not Muslims, but Ottomans, and they wanted, however, for their lives, their property, their prospects in the future to be protected and guaranteed. And so, even though particularly Armenians not of this social class, but of other groups in the country, were treated quite badly in eastern Anatolia, that area where the most Armenian peasants lived, suffering under the predations of Kurds and other nomads, nevertheless, repeatedly, they would declare their loyalty to the Sultan and try to live, hopefully, under a reformed government. Armenians resisted these extortionist demands of certain overlords, of Kurds particularly, but each time they might protest against unfair taxation or kidnapping by Kurds or Turkish lords, any protest, any resistance was interpreted by the state as rebellion, and therefore the whole wrath, the whole might of the state would come down on the Armenians. Eventually, Armenian revolutionaries called Fedai gathered. This is from the 1890s on. Few in number, it's true. Their numbers would be exaggerated by the Ottomans and by the Young Turks, but they were themselves active opponents of the Sultan's regime. They were active opponents until 1908, when they allied with Young Turk rebels against the bloody Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and indeed gave up their revolutionary aims, gave up their revolutionary underground, and declared that they wanted to work within the new constitutionalist system. Indeed, Armenians were among the most, you could say, militant supporters of the constitution and of reform within the empire. These guys were pretty fierce. They would be seen as models by Turkish revolutionaries, and they would always leave in the mind of many of the Muslims of the empire this image of these fierce warriors who were ready to fight to defend their peasant populations. One of the most famous was Antonin Ozanyan, who led several rebellions before 1908 in the mountains of eastern Anatolia. But basically, Armenians were a religious population. Indeed, their millet, their national community, religious community, was run largely by the church. So if we separate out, if we leave aside the argument of the denialists about harmony and outside agitators, what are we left with for explanation? Well, one explanation would be one that unfortunately rather comfortably sat among many Armenians popularly, and even some scholars, a kind of existentialist view of the Turk, of the terrible Turk. There was no need to explain why Turks would massacre Armenians. They're Turks. That's what they do, systematically. And all the various episodes of murder and deportation, surgun, or in the 1890s, or 1909 in Adana, or 1915, were all part of a single pattern of trying to eliminate the Armenians. Now, this particular view, which of course has within it both Orientalist and even racist connotations, it seems to me scholars have moved away from. That is, there's nothing essential about Turks that necessarily leads them to kill Armenians. Indeed, Armenians lived for half a millennium, many of them doing rather well under the Ottoman Empire. And there weren't massacres all the time. So some other explanation that pinpoints the causes needs to be elaborated in the period that we're discussing. So let me say that there are two basic camps of explanation, two clusters of explanation. One is that this was basically a religious struggle, so the religious argument, and the other was it was about nationalism. It was about two groups trying to make nations in a single territory. Let me look first at this argument from religion. The argument goes that the genocide was a war of Muslims against Christians. It was a jihad, and it was part of a long and traditional hostility against Ottoman Christians. Now you can imagine how popular and how sort of comfortable such a notion is, particularly in our own time when Muslims in general have been vilified as generally terrorists and jihadists. As Islamic rulers, it turns out, the Ottomans were relatively tolerant of non-Muslims, but only under the condition that they recognized their inferiority and remained loyal. It's not that religion did not contribute to conflict, particularly when European powers would intervene in the Ottoman Empire to support various Christians like the Greeks and the Armenians. The argument is made that Islam could not tolerate change, that it could not tolerate difference, and therefore this Muslim, and it's often called theocratic empire, eventually had to eliminate its non-Muslim subjects. My critique of this particular view is that, first of all, it removes all agency from the Armenians. Armenians, in this reading, are presented only as passive, innocent victims, rather than, as we've just seen with the revolutionaries, and even with these churchmen, active Ottoman subjects with their own political aspirations and organizations. In general, in the religious explanation, Turks acted, Armenians reacted. This characterization, this religious argument, is also a kind of reification, fancy word, which means just sort of hardening, making a thing of something, reification of Islam. It assumes an unchanging Islamic doctrine, a consistent and coherent dogma from which you can always predict easily rules of behavior and attitudes. In fact, Islam is complex, changes over time, and is different from place to place. The relationship of Muslims to their doctrine is not always consistent and predictable. Islam does not necessarily preclude political change. Indeed, in the middle of the 19th century, liberal Turkish, Ottoman bureaucrats led a reform movement of great significance called the Tanzimat. And after the end of the empire, Kemal Ataturk, of course, even though himself reducing the influence and even opposing the influence of Islam, carried out a secularizing reform in an essentially Islamic nation. This is not a theocracy either. Religious orthodoxy was certainly important. There were religious conservatives within the empire who opposed the change of the Tanzimat or reforming the sultans, or indeed the Young Turks after 1908. And the argument that Islam somehow could not tolerate heterogeneity or difference simply falls before the facts that this was an empire in which there was distinction and difference institutionalized into law, tolerated. In other words, empires are not like nation states. If empires are about difference and hierarchy, the nation state, at least in its ideal form, is about horizontal equivalency, that is, all citizens are equal, at least under the law, and about homogeneity. We're all the same, particularly ethno-national states, right? We're all Armenians, we're all Lithuanians, or so forth. Even in civic states, civic national states like the United States, we're all Americans in one way or another. And so this empire did tolerate difference. It even produced difference within it. It did not radically try to homogenize and become something like what the Kemalist Republic would become after 1923. So if we leave out that argument, then we move to the argument from nationalism. And this is a particularly slippery argument and one that needs some careful elaboration. First of all, nationalism. Nationalism is one of those terms that in popular usage, as well as in scholarly literature, is used to explain everything, right? You want to know what Mussorgsky's operas are about? Nationalism. You want to know what Hitler was doing in Poland? Nationalism. It doesn't matter. Nationalism is the easy catch-all explanation. Now, there are such things as national aspirations, national identity, nationalist movements. And you're going to see that though the Ottoman Empire was not about making an ethno-national, homogeneous Turkish state the way Kemal would after the war, nevertheless, nationalism will play a role. That is, the idea of making this empire more Turkic, more Islamic. But let me read to you a key statement by one of the great historians of the Ottoman Empire, Bernard Lewis of Princeton, lately Princeton, which can be read as an implied rationale, in a funny way, from a nationalist point of view, for the massacres of Armenians. Imagine that I'm Bernard Lewis here. For the Turks, the Armenian movement was the deadliest of all threats. From the conquered lands of the Serbs, Bulgars, and Albanians, they could, however reluctantly, withdraw, abandoning distant provinces and bringing the imperial frontier nearer home. But the Armenians, stretching across Turkey and Asia, from the Caucasian frontier to the Mediterranean coast, lay in the very heart of the Turkish homeland. And to renounce these lands would have meant not the truncation, but the dissolution of the Turkish state. Turkish and Armenian villages, inextricably mixed, had for centuries lived in neighborly association. Now a desperate struggle began between them, a struggle between two nations for the possession of a single homeland that ended with the terrible Holocaust of 1915, when 1.5 million Armenians perished, unquote. Bernard Lewis would later leave out that other part and receive an award from the Turkish government, but that's another story. Notice this. In what appears to be a cool and balanced statement, an understanding of why the Ottoman rulers were likely and in fact had to use mass violence against a perceived Armenian danger, Lewis does the following. First of all, he places the Armenians nearer the Turkish home. And then, I quote again, in the very heart of the Turkish homeland. Notice he's using language that is really about a nation state, not an empire. He's using language that assumes the legitimacy and the actuality of a nation state. In this transparent paragraph, Lewis is subtly rewriting the history of Anatolia from a land where the Armenians were the earliest inhabitants, they were first noted there in the 5th century BC, into one in which they become an obstacle to the national aspirations, perfectly justified, of the Turks, who can now claim Anatolia rather than Central Asia, from whence they came, as their homeland. More than that, the Ottomans, when they first came to this part of the world, made their homeland, so to speak, in the Balkans. It was the Balkans that was the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Then they conquered Istanbul, Constantinople, in 1453, and only later conquered Anatolia, where the Armenians and others lived. So this, you see, here is a scenario which argues that the Armenian genocide was a struggle between two nations already formed, fighting for a single homeland. It leaves out the idea that Armenians were willing and kept pledging their loyalty to the Ottoman Empire and were willing to live in the rather cosmopolitan setting in which they could be both Armenians, we need some reforms here, as well as Ottoman subjects. And it argues that the Turks had a lively Turkish nationalism as if it were ingrained and essentially part of their blood, when in fact the very idea of being a Turk, proud to be a Turk, only arose in the early 20th century. The word Turk actually meant a kind of lower class person. You would much rather be called Osmanlı, Ottoman, than Turk. Though there were theorists and writers in the early 20th century, many of them from the Caucasus, many of them not ethnically Turks, like Ziya Golkap, who was more Kurdish than Turkish, but nevertheless who argued for a new primacy and pride in being a Turk. What I would argue then is that the Young Turk Committee of Union and Progress, a group of secular modernists trying to preserve and save their empire, were certainly not religious fanatically Islamics, nor were they trying to create an ethno-national nation state. What they were interested in other words, instead of being nation builders, nation formers, they were more empire preservers. But here's the tricky part. They believed, like the Russians around the same time, in order to preserve an empire, and by the way, World War I is a period of imperial glory and expansion. We see the end of the empires at the end of the war, but it's not a time when empires think they're going to give up and that the nation state is inevitable because in the year 2000 will be mostly nation states. Empires are going to go on. The sun is not going to set on the British Empire until after World War II. So this is still an imperial age. They want that empire. But in order to secure the empire, it must be more Islamic, must be more Turkish. And the Armenians are a serious problem. They're a serious problem not only because they can't be assimilated according to the Turks, but because they are a rebellious, seditious group that other great powers, France and Britain and Russia particularly, use as a wedge to interfere in the internal life of the Ottoman Empire and to force the Ottomans to make reforms. So I'm not arguing that religion and nationalism are not absent here. The markers between these communities was certainly about religion, but it's not about doctrine and belief particularly. And I'm not saying that nationalism doesn't play a role as well, but I'm trying to emphasize the importance of the imperial setting rather than something that comes in the future. Armenians were, as this picture shows, perfectly willing to be good Ottomans. They dressed, they ate, they cavorted like Ottomans, though they also had their own communal and separate churches, organizations, and schools. In this particular example, this is earlier in the 1800. Here's a merchant and Hamal. Many of the Hamals, the porters, were Armenian as well. The Ottoman Empire, then, like other great empires, has to be understood as a cosmopolitan, composite state in which the ruling group is different and distinct from those it ruled. And yet, during World War I, and also in the 1890s, and at different times like 1909 in Adana, whatever equilibrium, whatever synthesis existed between these various millets or peoples in the empire broke down into vicious anti-Armenian massacres. That still needs explanation. And what I've been turning to is toward what I call a concept of affective disposition. Affective disposition is the emotional environment, the universe of understandings emotionally constructed, which tells you who you are and who the other is, and allows you to do certain things or conceive of certain behaviors as legitimate and possible and others as impossible. Rather than religion and nationalism in and of themselves, I'm interested in the ideology and evolution of the emotional disposition, the affective universe in which first the Sultan and then the Young Turks and eventually masses of Kurds and Turks began to understand the Armenians in a certain way that is as a deep existential threat to their own existence and to the existence of their state. And within that affective disposition, certain decisions became not only possible, but rational, acceptable, and even desirable. A cascade of social, political, and international destabilizations, the loss of many parts of the empire, battered older ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, and generated, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, in the 1890s, again in 1909 in Adana, and in 1915 throughout the empire, generated a toxic mix of past experiences, could be personal or social, conflicts over land, feelings that one was losing one's status. These Armenians, these gavurs, these unbelievers are living better than us. How come Muslims aren't on top and yet these Armenian merchants and middlemen are on top? If this sounds familiar to what happened to Jews in Middle and Eastern Europe, the parallel is deliberate. There's an anxiety that developed over the future. Indeed, in much of ethnic conflict, in ethnic cleansings, and in what eventually becomes genocide, we find that these fears of the future, of a future in which you will be disadvantaged, if not eliminated, generate the most violent kinds of behavior of various human actors. At a moment in World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was in danger, its very existence at stake, the Russians on one front, the British in Gallipoli, the Young Turks, I believe, acted on the fears and resentments that had been generating and festering over time, and directed their efforts to resolve their anxieties by dealing with those they perceived to threaten their survival. But not with external enemies, but an internal enemy that they saw linked to the Entente, their external enemies. Now, this argument skates very close to the argument of the denialists. It almost seems to rationalize what the Turks are about to do. In other words, as a historian, historians often load up explanations. We overdetermine things. We're not like political scientists. They believe in parsimony. We believe in throwing everything into the pot, seeing what sticks. So we have lots of explanations here. But what I'm arguing is different. What to the denialists and their sympathizers appears to be a rational and justified strategic choice to eliminate a rebellious and seditious population, in my view, is seen as the outcome of a pathological construction of the Armenian enemy, a mental picture shaped by these deep emotions and perceptions of the Ottoman world whose origins and costs we need to examine. No matter how many times Armenians gave up their arms, pledged allegiance to the empire, worked within the parliament and the constitution, no matter how many times they pleaded with the Sultan for redress, but always working through the system, their efforts were seen as devious, as suspect, as impossible to be read simply on the surface. And how difficult it is for someone, once you are the product and the recipient of that kind of superstition and suspicion, to justify your behavior. Now, the question then that has to be asked, were the Armenians an existential threat? Did they really determine and shape their own destiny and their own fate? And let me say a few things briefly about these events. Here is a picture in 1908, Armenians in the crowd celebrating the constitutionalist revolution of the Young Turks, the moment at which they gave up their arms, their underground organizations, closed radical newspapers, and worked within, and even worked as allies, coalition partners in elections, right up until the end of the empire with the Young Turks. So they repeatedly declare their loyalty, but it doesn't seem to help. A year after these events, in the city of Adana, on the Mediterranean coast in the east, where the Mediterranean takes that turn down toward Lebanon and Syria, in that city, rumors developed that the Armenians, who are now happy about this constitutionalist situation and are forming organizations, clubs, being more public, publishing newspapers, are seen more and more as suspicious and dangerous by local Muslims who claim they really want an independent kingdom here, the kingdom of Cilicia, which existed between 1080 and 1375, 500 years or more earlier. The rumors become reality. And they're perpetuated by the local nationalists and local Young Turk activists. And so a massacre occurred, sorry about the quality of this picture, and the city of Adana was destroyed, and 20,000 Armenians were massacred in a few weeks in that moment. Now that event is a kind of local pogrom. It's an urban riot. It's not a genocide or even part of the genocide, but it does reflect already this growing, festering affective disposition, the way the Armenians are being perceived and considered. By World War I, the Young Turks convinced themselves that the Armenians were a fifth column, before the term was even invented. In World War I, the Ottomans went to war against Russia. They launched an attack on Russian ships and the base of Sevastopol. You might have heard about that lately, in Crimea. And they launched this war, and Enver Pasha sent an expedition to the east to fight a great battle. The empire by 1914, 1915, the winter of 1914, was in the hands of three men. One, Talat Pasha, the Minister of Interior, was most important. He was really the architect and author of the genocide. He was later killed here in Berlin, in Charlottenburg, after the war when he exiled himself here. Talat Pasha and these two guys, Enver Pasha, Minister of War, and Cemal Pasha. Pasha, they're not brothers. That means general in Turkish. Somebody calls them the Pasha brothers. It's not right? Those three guys are the ones who carry out this event. Now, I see the battle that the Russians and Turks fought in the winter of 1914, 1915, the so-called Battle of Sarikamish, where Enver sends a huge army of 90,000 men to fight the Russians. And the Turkish army is destroyed. It's the worst defeat in Ottoman military history. And about 45,000, some claim higher, 70,000, but the latest figure is about 45,000 Ottoman Turkish soldiers are killed. Armenians were fighting at this battle on both sides of the front, because there were Armenians in Russia as well as in Turkey. They were in Ottoman uniforms and they were as volunteers on the other side. When the battle was lost and Enver returned to Istanbul, the narrative that developed was, we lost the battle because of the treachery of the Armenians. There were those volunteers on the other side. Armenians were deserting. And it is right after this battle, already in February 1915, that you find the first stage of the genocide, the disarming of the Armenian men, of the soldiers, turning them into labor battalions. Eventually, they would be killed. In other words, the muscle of the Armenian community has now been removed. When Armenians resisted, this is again Sarikamish, when the Armenians resisted at places like Van, the oncoming slaughter that was going on around Van in the villages, that was seen as a rebellion and justification for mass deportation. And then systematically, and I'm not going to go into the details of this event, the Armenians were removed from their homes. Now you've removed the soldiers. You've arrested on April 24th, that's the day we celebrate or commemorate the genocide, the intellectuals in the country, and you've removed the brains as well, and then it's only a matter of deporting women, children, and old people. There is no smoking gun or single order to deport and kill the Armenians. Turkish archives, which by the way are slowly being opened, reveal enormous documents and telegrams that show conclusively that Talat and others were very curious about what was happening to the Armenians. The Young Turks worked on two levels, a state level, so certain kinds of communications went out, and an informal party level, and through a group called the Special Organization, Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, which went out and carried out a lot of these massacres. This is a messy genocide. It occurs differently in different parts of the country. Massacres, random killings, plunder in different parts. Some Turkish valis or governors stood up and said, we're not carrying out these orders. They were removed. Some of them were killed. So at the end, when people were sent as far as the deserts of Syria, massacres continued there until all were eliminated. Now let me just conclude then with the way I would put this picture together and try to explain why I think it happened. And I come back to this notion of affective disposition. One of the best sources we have, indeed a source on the genocide that in many ways has shaped the ongoing historiography, is the memoir, the dispatches first to the State Department, and then the memoir of the American ambassador in Istanbul back to Washington, Henry Morgenthau. Henry Morgenthau was a friend of Talat Pasha. They went riding together in the Belgrade forest near the Black Sea. And so when these massacres and reports of these massacres came in, Morgenthau went to see Talat. And Talat reported to him. And if you listen to this quotation, you might see some of the themes that were in the mind of the Young Turks. I've asked you here today, said Talat to the ambassador, so I can explain our position on the whole Armenian subject. We base our objections to the Armenians on three distinct grounds. In the first place, they have enriched themselves at the expense of the Turks. In the second place, they are determined to domineer over us and establish a separate state. In the third place, they have openly encouraged our enemies. They have assisted the Russians in the Caucasus, and our failure there is largely explained by their actions. We have therefore come to the irrevocable decision that we shall make them powerless before the war is ended. Morgenthau attempted to refute Talat's points one by one. He said, it's no use for you to argue. We've already disposed of 3/4 of the Armenians. There are none left at all in Bitlis, Van, and Erzurum. The hatred between the Turks and the Armenians is now so intense that we've got to finish with them. If we don't, they will plan their revenge. And he said, I've told you this so that you will understand our view is fixed and nothing can change it. We will not have any Armenians anywhere in Anatolia. They can live in the desert, but nowhere else. Morgenthau, in despair, said to Talat, you are making a terrible mistake. And he repeated it 3 times. You're making a terrible mistake. And Talat looked at him, firmly closed his lips, shook his head and said, yes, we make mistakes, but we never regret. The evidence now is overwhelming that this was, in fact, a planned elimination of a given people. It fits all definitions, scholarly, legal, UN, of genocide. The event would reverberate for many decades after this. It would become the source of that famous quotation, which maybe many of your parents told you, what about the starving Armenians? Because they were the orphans, they were the refugees after this great war. It was the source of all kinds of propaganda. Here's a picture of a Turk taunting young children with bread, starving children. This is a fake. This is not a true. This was an arranged picture as part of the propaganda campaign. But the Armenian cause, this unique event, the likes of which had never occurred up to this time near Europe, though it had, of course, in European colonies, inspired what eventually became the human rights movement, humanitarian movement, and eventually human rights. The first time the words crime against humanity was used in an international document was in May 1915, when the Russians, the French, and the British issued a statement to the Ottoman government saying, you will pay for this. This is a crime against humanity. The view of the Turks would never really recover, even up to this day when they're trying to get into Europe, from that terrible Turk vision that you saw at that time. That would be confirmed in this movie of this young woman who was the gripping heroine of a book, The Auction of Souls, and eventually this movie ravished Armenia. The Armenian genocide, and I'll finish with this, was the central event, often left out of Turkish historiography, in the last stages of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. The traditional imperial paradigm that had reigned in that empire was steadily undermined by a number of factors like the revolutionary changes taking place in the West, the attempt to modernize, the discourse of the nation, which many Young Turks adopted. But eventually, after centuries of governing the Armenians as a separate ethno-religious community, Young Turks became convinced there was no way to survive without their physical and cultural elimination. They began to see Armenians as an alien people, disloyal, subversive, separatist, a threat to their future existence. This perception was compounded more broadly by anxiety about the relative economic success of Armenian businessmen and craftsmen, the competition for limited resources in the East, mainly land, and a sense that the Armenian successes were reversing the traditional imperial status hierarchy with Muslims on top and the non-Muslims on the bottom. I want to say that the Young Turks carried out inhuman, monstrous acts. Some, particularly many Armenians, think of them as monsters or madmen. But I follow Ambassador Morgenthau, and I'm trying to argue here that they were both calculating and emotional actors, not madmen or monsters, but sadly all too human. Once they embarked on this genocidal policy, they appealed to the affective, emotional understandings of ordinary Turks and Kurds about Armenians, who then carried out the mass killings. The leaders found resonance to this affective disposition in the population and were able to arouse very difficult emotions in people that led to murder, plunder, rape, and to the most wanted cruelty. Ultimately, as in any genocide, it's the elites that bear responsibility. They initiated the policy. They demanded compliance. They played on the available popular emotional repertoire. They rationalized and legitimated activity that in most times and most places would have been beyond the law and the norms of society. The genocide was not successful in one sense. We're still here. Armenians are still around. There even is a little Armenian republic struggling near Ararat. But with this foundational crime, the Young Turks did what so many other nation states have done. They eliminated people and got the land. And therefore, on the basis of that land, they built an ethnically Turkish republic in Anatolia. I don't know what the lessons are, but we might think carefully about the pathologies that lead to the nation state. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Kellen was my name. I was an East European correspondent for the Observer and Financial Times during the Cold War. I am interested in what the role of the Kurds was in all this. Was it in any way similar to that of the Ukrainians and Baltic people against the Jews as henchmen, or were they willing? Were they simply pushed into it, or?
That's a very good question. The question was about the Kurds. Eastern Anatolia, which was the least well-governed, very undergoverned part of the Ottoman Empire, was a social ecology or environment in which there was a complex relationship between Armenian peasants, Armenian craftsmen, Armenian merchants, very often in the towns, Turkish officials, Turkish peasants, and Kurdish peasants and nomads, many of whom were agas or lords over the other peasants, Muslim and Armenian. So you have very complicated relationship in which there's a very intense squeeze on the land. So Armenians were peasants, but muhajirs from the Caucasus, that is refugees, come from Russia after the Caucasian Wars in the 1860s, and then from the Balkans after the loss of the Balkans, particularly after 1912-13, all putting pressure on this land. So Kurds participated in the genocide. They were used by Turks, and they generated, they had their own claims and their own antagonisms and their own views, many of them similar to what I've been talking about, against Armenians. So they were very much involved. Kurds, of course, would then continue to exist in Kemalist Turkey after the Armenians are eliminated, after the Greeks are chased out after the Greco-Turkish War and the populations exchanges in the early 20s. So you have now an ethno-homogeneous Turkey, but you've got tens of millions of Kurds there, who the Turks will call mountain Kurds, will deny their right to education. Even today, you can't have elementary education in the Kurdish language. If you go to Turkey today, to Eastern Anatolia, to historic Armenia, to Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, and so forth, which I've done on several occasions, and you meet Kurds, it's all Kurdistan now. And Kurds will tell you, they have their own discourse. They remember. And they say, yes, it happened. They recognize the genocide. They've even built monuments to the genocide. They say, we know it had happened. Then they say, the Turks made us do it. They promised us that if we killed the Armenians, we could have their houses and their land. By the way, you built very nice houses. We're still living in them. So there is both a sense of participation, kind of shifting of guilt toward the Turks. They'll say things like, they had you for breakfast and they're having us for dinner. So because the Kurds are so anti-Turkish now that they have this view. And then the last question they always ask is, where's the gold? They believe that Armenians hid gold under their houses and in the churches. And if you go to the churches, there are huge holes where people are digging up. So there's a lot of strange, odd mythologies and memories that are at play here. But they certainly did participate, yeah. Yeah, over here and then here, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Marietta König. I'm a political analyst, but I have a historic question. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on the Istanbul trials, the motivation for them, and also the impact, if it had any impact at all. Thank you.
So after the war was over, and Turkey surrendered in 1918, Istanbul was occupied by the Allies, by the British primarily, right? And in that period, there's still an Ottoman Empire, and there's still a Sultan, right? And the British and the Turks who were anti-Young Turk, but now in power under this Sultan, began to organize trials against the Young Turks. And they tried Talat and Enver. They found them guilty of mass murder. They condemned them to death, et cetera, et cetera. But Enver had fled to, Talat had fled to Germany. Enver was in Central Asia. He would be killed there. Cemal went to Tiflis. He would be killed there. Armenians would take revenge in these various people. And others, Shakir also came to Germany and so forth. The trials, for a very long time, were not well known. It was very hard to reconstruct the record. It was published in newspapers. They were hard to receive. They are now published. You can read them in German. You can read them in English. You can read them in modern Turkish. And they're very revealing. Now, those who participate in the denial of the Armenian genocide consider these tainted sources because they were, like the Nuremberg trial, they were trials by the victors over a defeated population. When you actually read them, they're extraordinary. There's so much information, local information, which can then be collaborated against other documents. So you find, and the people who are confessing to these things are also justifying what they did or denying some of the other things they did. So they have to be used like any historical source very carefully, but they're also extraordinarily rich, and they ought to be read and utilized. Along with, by the way, dozens of memoirs. These people wrote memoirs as well, including Rashid Bey, who was the murderous Wali of Diyarbakir. And he excuses what he did, he tries to justify what he did, but he admits, well, it was those Circassians, those people from Russia. They are the ones who mostly carried. I tried to stop them, but they tell what actually happened. So you can play these sources against each other and create a very interesting picture. Yeah. You had a question here.
My name is Tessa Hofmann. I'm from the Free University Berlin, a scholar of genocide as well. My question relates to the briefly mentioned in your introduction Assyrians. I would call them Aramaic-speaking Christians because many do not acknowledge the term of Assyrians. Nevertheless, the first deportation order, which was issued by the Home Ministry, relates to them. Could you briefly explain commonalities and differences in the fate of the Aramaic-speaking Christians and the Armenians?
Right. Very good question. Thank you, Tessa. Tessa Hoffman has been one of the pioneers in the study of the genocide before many people, except Armenians, were interested in this topic, and I'm very grateful to that, for your efforts and to your question. Yes, if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have had to say I don't know anything about it. But as you know, through your work and through the work of David Gaunt, there's a wonderful book on Diyarbakir, which tells these stories about these Assyrians. And in our own travels to Diyarbakir and Mardin, we've met Assyrians or Syriacs or Asori. We have many different names for them. I'm going to call them Assyrians just for shorthand. They're not a single religious group. They are Christians, largely Monophysite Christians, closely related to the Armenian Christian church. We have our own church. They were put by the Ottoman Turks in the same millet, the same religious community as the Armenians. So they would suffer by this association. They were also targeted with very specific kinds of affective attitudes toward them that are very similar to the Armenians. And Tessa Hoffman is quite right. The first murderous actions in what will later become a genocide occurs on the Persian-Ottoman frontier when the Ottoman army goes into Persia and begins wiping out Assyrian and also Armenian villages. And Talat sees these Assyrians also as a dangerous population and orders their deportation. So they're eliminating or reducing the population of non-Muslims, Greeks in the west, Assyrians in the east, Armenians all over the place, all through this period. In the answering that question, I hinted at something that is one of the findings that our Watts group that Pamela spoke about came up with, though others like Michael Mann have also emphasized it. And that is, like the scholarship much of the scholarship on the Holocaust, scholarship on the Armenian genocide is now emphasizing more and more what you might call cumulative radicalization, a term that Donald Bloxham, a British scholar, uses. And what does that mean, cumulative radicalization? Is that we don't see this as something planned, a blueprint. They set out to do this from the beginning. And neither did, by the way, Hitler. That is, over time, certain things began to happen, and more radical policies were adopted. At the beginning, some of the Armenians were deported westward because they wanted to reduce the population around the frontier or on the front. And later, they would be systematically moved into the desert, and eventually they would be murdered there as well. So that the actions of the Young Turks became more and more radical over time. I saw a hand back here, but you can find people.
It's almost 40 years ago that I read the book of Franz Werfel, The 40 Days of Musadak. And I want to know if Franz Werfel had also explained the Armenian genocide with the effective disposition.
That's a good question. I have to go back and read it now. It's been 40 years since I read it too. The interesting thing about that particular book, which is of course a wonderful novel, is that Werfel and his reading public knew about this event. That is, between the world wars, people understood that this was a live issue. It wasn't anything that was actively denied, not until quite later, until after World War II. And Werfel wrote this wonderful novel. It was lauded. MGM was going to make a movie of this novel, and then the Turkish government enjoined the State Department to stop the making of the movie. The State Department pressured MGM, and the movie was never made. What his actual explanation is, or if there is a kind of explanation in the book, I simply don't remember. Maybe someone in the audience has read the book more recently. Yeah.
Michael Giesen, thank you very much for this very interesting talk on a subject that I guess many of us don't really know that much about. My question is, what is the status of academic exchange or conversation with the Turks, to just say it in a very simple way? And is your insistence on using the term genocide helpful? I mean, I can understand to further the cause and to make clear what has happened, you have to do it. But in the context of an academic conversation and getting, Turkish experts engaged, could it be helpful to kind of be less clear? Is the word in itself a barrier to this exchange, or not?
It's a good question, very good question. So when we started WATS, this workshop in Armenian Turkish scholarship, so we're talking roughly, I went to Turkey in 1998. I gave a talk on the genocide, which was illegal at the time. I quickly skipped out of the place. And I realized there was a receptive audience of students mostly, and some scholars. So we started this effort to bring Armenians, Turks, Kurds together. And we didn't insist on the word genocide. It was called Workshop in Armenian Turkish Scholarship. Some people took up the term. Others came to the term later. Some would rather not use the term for other reasons, like it makes us less effective in Turkey. But over the years, since we were doing this, now almost 15 years that we've been doing it, the term itself, rather than it's a barrier to some, but it's also a term that if one doesn't recognize and use it, that has a meaning. In other words, not using it or using it both have an effect. And the term itself has been adopted and used by what I call the progressive intelligentsia in Turkey. So people, friends of ours like Fikret Adani, who taught here at Bochum, or Halil Berktay at Sabancı, or many people, some in this room, who have worked on these subjects, have taken the term. The state denies the term. So the deniers are identified with the most regressive, reactionary, anti-European, authoritarian, deep state elements in Turkey. And this genocide word, and talking openly about the genocide, is identified with a more progressive group which is interested in European integration, greater democracy, multinationality, tolerance, all the good things, right? And so the Armenian genocide is like the thin edge of the wedge that helped undermine, at a critical time, the Kemalist, nationalist, militarist, authoritarian edifice that had been put in place for 70 years, right? Now, it happened that as we came, our little humble scholars coming along to do this discussion, it happened at that time that an Islamist party with a democratic agenda, the AKP, the party of Erdogan, came to power and didn't persecute people who used the term as much. There's some arrests and some things. And one of the members of our group, a very brave and wonderful Armenian Turkish journalist, Hrant Dink, was murdered in January 2007, and he was part of our project. So we had some bad setbacks and all, but at the same time, when I talked to Halil Bey and asked him, has there been progress on this issue, Halil says, you know, Ron, I get many less death threats now. So there is some progress. The civil society exists in Turkey, as you saw with the Gezi Park events last year, and you can see now in the actions in Turkey. This is a radically changing, rapidly changing society. And one of our things in doing Watts was to say, don't turn your back on those elements, small as they are in Turkey, who want to have this dialogue, which is what we did. And I hope Europe won't turn its back on Turkey either and keep it out rather than think about, you know, opening these things up. But that's not my problem, that's your problem. Yeah.
So in the beginning of the presentation, you show us some photos of those atrocities of dead bodies from this genocide. I was curious, who took those photos?
He did. This is Arman Wegner from Wuppertal. This is a German soldier during World War I who took photographs. He was arrested by the Turks, many photographs destroyed. There are many left. There are books in German and English and other languages. And he smuggled them out. And his son is still promoting his father's work. And so he is one of the heroes in this event, as are these two men, James Bryce, who was a British aristocrat and who published an important book, The Treatment of the Armenians During the War. And of course, Johannes Lepsius, the German pastor, whose house is now a museum and conference center, and we have the director of that center here tonight, in Potsdam. And you can go and see his work there as well. So there were people at the time and subsequently who were recording and discussing these things. And as I said, the real denialist campaign only began in the 1950s and 60s.
I'm sorry, I have another question and a comment. So was the moment of 1908, the victory of the Young Turks and the Armenians, similar to maybe what happened in Russia in 1905 or 1970s? Because there's also happenings of pogroms accompanied to the revolutionary moment. And also I want to ask, how do you see your approach of emotional accumulation of this radicalism challenge the idea of a teleological way to look at those genocide, maybe perpetrated more by those nationalist and the religious explanations? Thanks.
This revolution, 1908, is often compared to the Iranian Revolution, which was almost simultaneous, 1906, 7, 8, 9, and the 1905, 6, 7 revolution in Russia. They're all efforts within autocratic states to create some kind of constitutionalist order. It's very difficult. They're all empires who are trying to figure out a new way to be modern and constitutional in a particular historical conjuncture when the nation state is also threatening them and local nationalisms are threatening them. But they're very comparable, and there is scholarly work on that basis. On the question of emotions, and so I'm not sure I quite understood the thrust of your question. I'm not sure I understood the thrust of your question, but I'll think about it. Sorry.
I'm Rolf Schnelle from the Free University of Berlin. I wonder whether you could comment a little bit about the role of the German military. I remember reading articles about the military being involved with the logistics of activities, and then a totally different aspect from your explanation about the situation, minorities in the country at the time. One wonders whether nowadays the reluctance to accept diversity within the Turkish state is still a sort of late reflection of what you have been describing?
That's a good question, yeah. Let me take the second one first. Clearly, there are legacies of histories. And what the Young Turks started with their idea of nationalizing the empire, though keeping it an empire, eventually drifts into or turns into, metastasizes into this nation-state idea of Kemal. And then it's really a vigorous program of forming a single nationality of Turks. And everyone has to be a Turk. And some groups like Kurds are thought to be assimilatable, and a great effort is made, and they fail at that. And others like Armenians, others say you should get rid of them. And they attempt to get rid of them even afterwards, not by murdering them, but making it convenient for them to leave and so forth. So those legacies still continue in Turkey today. The opposite trend is also there. There's a tremendous interest in Turkey now in finding your roots, in what you might call the neo-Ottomanism, in looking back to the empire in its positive directions as a more cosmopolitan and varied society of tolerance, of difference. And you find that in Istanbul particularly, right? And that would be good for Armenians, of course, for Jews, for Kurds even, if that trend continues. We don't know exactly what the move of the AKP will be, the current government. They seem to be interested in emphasizing the diversity or maybe the singularity, let's say, of the Islamic peoples. So they'll maybe recognize the Kurds, etc. They're less interested in some of the other peoples. But we'll see how that develops. The question of the German responsibility or role in the genocide is a very fraught one, a very difficult one. And there were attempts by certain scholars, I won't mention names, but Vahak and Dadrian, among others, but there was who would, in fact, argue that they were complicit and involved. Now, here, others in the room may know more about this. It's complicated for this reason. There were Germans who were around. There were Germans who knew what was happening. There were Germans like Wegner and Lepsius who tried to help. People on the railroad tried to help. There were reports back to the Kaiser. The Kaiser said, don't talk about that. They're our allies. That's their business. Leave it alone. But others tried to intervene and so forth. So there's a mixture. But the idea that somehow the Germans organized or insinuated or instigated this event is not correct, I think, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe one more question and we'll, yeah, or whomever.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to know, in your opinion, the reason why the government doesn't accept what happened is religions, or if we put aside the religions question, social and problems also. Because until now, the Armenian in there, they have also problems. And I would like to know your opinion. Perhaps nowadays with another touch, but still the problem or not?
This is a very interesting and difficult question for this reason. It doesn't make sense to me. That is, when I gave that first talk in Istanbul in 1998, I said, you know, you have many problems in Turkey. You have the problem of Cyprus. You have the problem of the Kurds. You have the problem of getting into Europe. You have problems of poverty. You have problems of availing or unavailing of women. You've got a lot of problems in Turkey. Why are you focusing and making a huge fuss about this Armenian problem, which is almost 100 years old, when there are only 40 or 50,000 Armenians in Turkey? So in one way, it doesn't make sense. Unless you think about affective dispositions, unless you think about symbolic renderings of the other and of who you are. It is, and one woman came up to me after that talk and said, you don't understand, and I think she had a point, because I didn't understand. You don't understand how fragile Turkish self-identity is, how little we know ourselves, And we're not sure who exactly we are. Are we Europe? Are we Asia? Are we Islamic? Are we secular? Are we people who could carry out such a thing like a genocide? And if you look at what Erdogan said, and Mrs. Merkel was wonderful when she told him, get with it already, you know, enough of this, just recognize your own history, a couple of weeks ago. Erdogan says Turks are not the kind of people who could do this kind of thing. So that's one aspect. More fundamentally, but connected to that, and I'll end with this, is that if one recognized the genocide and the expulsion of the Greeks and the killing of the Assyrians and the way in which Anatolia was made artificially, invented as the Turkish homeland, you are undermining the whole grand narrative, the master narrative of modern Turkish history. World War I and its aftermath is called the War of Liberation. It's Kurtuluş Savaşı, you know, in Turkish. It's the war that founds this state. And yet you're telling us that we made this state on the basis of mass murder and the elimination of the people who were here before? And I say to them, I'm an American. I understand this, you know. I think I know Australia, Israel. You want to talk about nation states? Come, we'll talk. Thank you very much.